All right, so welcome back to A&P. So this is chapter 5, the integumentary system. So we're going to be talking about skin. On this image that you're looking at here, this is the gentleman who does body worlds, and so that's one of the body world, I guess, exhibits that you would see if you go. You can see this individual is actually looking at their own skin. Now our skin is going to be the largest organ in our body. Some textbook numbers for you. They'll tell you that, average kind of numbers. Your skin has a surface area of 22 square feet, pretty decent amount of size. So organ-wise, largest that way. And it also is one of the largest organs weight-wise, so somewhere around 10 to 11 pounds of you is skin. Again, these are textbook numbers, so depending on how big, small you are, they'll vary. Okay. All right. So let's start talking about some of the things, and I'll kind of get rid of me for a bit. All right, so it's a very important organ in our body. It has a lot of accessory structures that we're going to end up talking about, things like different glands and hair and stuff like that. But all of that put together is going to make up the integumentary system. It has lots of different functions, so just a couple. One is to protect you. I think that's kind of obvious. If you bump yourself, your skin is there to keep the scratches from damaging like tissue underneath, whatever they may be, muscles, fat, nerves, stuff like that. It'll help maintain your body temperature. So our skin has lots of sweat glands, for example. So I think we all know that here in Arizona, when it gets hot, we start to sweat, right? It helps cool us down. It gives us quite a bit of sensory information about our environment. So we have lots of different nerve receptors in our skin. So it allows us to tell, like, all right, what are we touching? What is touching us in some instances as well. I just want you to take a second and think about this. What other information could the skin tell you about? That's not one of these. Like when you look at somebody, you look at them, think about it. What can you tell just by looking at someone? Perhaps you can tell age, right? That's an obvious one. You look at someone's skin and you're like, oh, well, my grandmother's skin looks very different than, like a kid's skin would, or even mine. Okay, so it can tell us about age of an individual. You think of other things like, how about health? You ever look at someone, they look really pale? Are you like, oh, you don't look so good? Or someone's like nauseous. Sometimes they almost have a green tinge to their skin, right? Oh, that's not good. Or maybe they're flushed, right? That doesn't look good. Or how about something like shingles or chicken pox or, any other kind of hive or something like that, right? Another indication that, ooh, something is wrong with that person. Let me stay away from them, right? Like, so there's going to be a lot of outward tells about an individual's health and whether or not you should be kind of going up close to them because maybe it's infectious. You don't know, right? Sometimes they can tell you about emotions, right? So sometimes it isn't sickness. I mean, I'm sure we've all had the experience where we've gotten embarrassed and we blushed, right? So our skin's going to tell the other person, hey, you just embarrassed that other person across from you. Good job. Do it again, right? Or whatever. And think about other things too. I mean, there's tons of different things that our skin is going to tell us about. Another one is just, look at the things we do to our skin, right? We pierce it, we tattoo it, we tan it, put makeup on it, right? So it kind of tells us a little bit about sometimes our ideals or our philosophies, and things like that, right? So just, and I'm sure there's plenty of other things that maybe you guys have come up with that I didn't mention. But really, like when you really think about it, our skin is super important because it really is that very first communication between us and another individual, as well as, it's the thing that's between us and the environment, right? All right, so let's just talk up then about the structure of the skin. Okay, it has two different layers. Right, so the two layers are the epidermis and the dermis. So I'm going to try my nifty little pen here, and hopefully this guy will work today for me. All right, so let's see. So right here, epidermis, dermis. Now you'll notice there's this other layer right here. the subcutaneous layer, that is technically not a layer of the skin. I think it's one of those things that we, in everyday talk, kind of think about it as part of our skin, but it's not. Scientifically, and within this class, there's two layers, epidermis and then the dermis. Okay, subcutaneous is exactly as its name implies, subcutaneous, it's underneath the skin. Okay, all right, so again, not part of the skin. Okay. And again, we'll talk a little bit about all these different structures. So we have different things like hair, right? So as you're noticing here in the epidermis and dermis, you have hair. You have this thing that looks like muscle, this kind of yellowy stuff, these nerves, blood vessels, right? You're kind of seeing some glands. So there's lots of other structures that are part of our skin. So let's just kind of take a look at the epidermis first, right? It's made up of stratified squamous epithelium, and I should mention in here that it is keratinized stratified squamous, right? So you can kind of add that at the beginning of this. So this is actually keratinized, my amazing handwriting when I'm writing on these tablets. So again, our skin that's outward to the environment, like on our face, hands, body, that's all going to be keratinized. Okay. Right. One of the key things, if you'll notice, there's no blood vessels in the epidermis, so that's avascular. That's what that term means, no blood vessels. We're going to see 4 different types of cells that we're going to talk about in a minute, and maybe you can kind of see those here already. So you have these Langerhans cells. You'll see a lot of these different keratinocytes right up here. The majority of these cells are going to be this type. They're melanocytes, producing melanin, giving you your skin pigmentation. And then we'll also have different sensory cells. And there's 5 distinct layers, and that's what you're kind of seeing in these 2 images. So you have the stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, spinosum, basale. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about those as well. All right, so let's talk about the skin cells. So those keratinocytes, right? So they're called keratinocytes. So whenever you see this term cyte, first of all, if I haven't mentioned this, whenever you see this term cyte, that means cell. Okay, and usually the word that is preceding it will give you some indication of what type of cell that is. Okay, so in this context, a keratinocyte is a cell that produces keratin. Well, that's fairly straightforward, right? Okay, so these keratinocytes, let's see if I can get my pen up and going again. These are about 90% of the epidermal cells are these keratinocytes, so you have lots of them. And so that keratin is going to be really good for protection. So it protects the skin from microbes, certain chemicals, not all, right? But certain chemicals. And in fact, a lot of, it's actually pretty good at chemicals. Like a lot of times if we spill something on ourselves, as depending on how concentrated it is, we usually can just run over to the sink and wash it off, and there's very little damage. I mean, obviously not with everything, but pretty good at protecting us from chemicals, and even heat. Okay. Oh, and let me get rid of that. Let's see if I can get rid. All right, so hopefully you can see that quite a bit better. Melanocytes, so the next type of skin cell is going to be melanocyte. These again produce melanin. It's important in giving us our skin color. The more melanin you have, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a sec, but the more melanin you have, the darker your skin color will be. And its main role is basically to absorb damaging ultraviolet light. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. Okay. All right, next type of cell are these Langerhans cells. These are basically going to help our immune system. So they're going to recognize an invading microbe and they're going to destroy it. So basically that's their job. So if it sees a microbe that's on the surface of your skin that shouldn't be there, it helps destroy it. Okay, keeps those unfriendly microbes at bay. And then we also have Merkel cells, and then these are going to help us in our sensation of touch. We'll talk a little bit more about Merkel cells a bit later on in the semester. All right, so let's talk about these different layers. So you can kind of see them. Let's see, let me get my pen back here. Again, right here we have at the very surface of our skin is the stratum corneum, right? And the stratum basale is here, I guess the deepest in. Now, the way scientists think of layers of the epidermis is not from the outside going in, but from the inside going out, right? So we start with the stratum basale as when we talk about the layers of the skin, we'll usually start here. And that's because in the stratum basale, and I don't know how well you'll see this right here, but that is where we have these cells that are mitotic. So all those cells that are dividing are actually found in the stratum basale. So this cell will divide and it basically pushes cells up, 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 until we get to the stratum corneum, and then you can see by the time we get there, the cells die off and then they kind of flake off. So when you have those kind of skin flakes and stuff, those are these dead keratinocytes in the stratum corneum just simply flaking off, right, getting pushed off and dying. Okay. So after the stratum basale, we have the spinosum, then the granulosum, lucidum, and then the corneum is the most outermost layer. All right. So let's take a look at these a little bit more specifically. So stratum basale is also called the stratum germinativum. Either term is fine. I would learn both. They both tell kind of slightly different bits of information. So stratum basale is telling you that it's at the base. Stratum germinativum, so when something germinates, it means it's the growing layer. So it's basically a layer that's growing. It's the one that's mitotic. It's dividing. Okay, so we have these Merkel cells, those receptors, those touch receptors, the melanocytes, the ones that have melanin, the keratinocytes. Again, vast majority of these cells that are dividing are these keratinocytes. And the stem cells, well, that are actually doing the dividing, but they will give rise to these keratinocytes. Okay. Those cells are attached by hemidesmosomes. So at the stratum basale, it's that one layer of cell thick, right here at the very bottom. They are attaching to the dermis via hemidesmosomes, right? And they'll attach to one another and to cells around them by desmosomes. So kind of, if you remember that back from when we talked about those different cell attachments. Okay, so our next layer is the stratum spinosum. It's called spinosum because scientists, like when they prepare these slides, this layer tends to dehydrate, and it's not super obvious in this image, but the first scientists that were looking at it, the way their techniques work, these cells kind of shrank, and where you had that cytoskeleton, if you kind of remember back to those intermediate filaments and stuff that give cells their shape, those were sort of, they ended up poking out a little bit. So it made these cells look spiny, so they called it the stratum spinosum. Right? So anyway, this layer is going to give your skin strength, flexibility, and also the melanin from melanocytes is transferred into keratinocytes in this layer. And just real quickly for you, melanocytes are kind of an odd-shaped cell. Like all these other ones sort of look cuboidal in shape, right? Kind of look square-shaped. Melanocytes, when you look at them, they're these really large cells, and they have these sort of, I don't know, finger-like projections, I guess. So here's a melanocyte. This big thing is a melanocyte. Right? And what you end up finding is that these little areas in here, you have these keratinocytes, right? So they almost kind of cup several keratinocytes, right? And the way they transfer melanin is kind of interesting. Let's see if I can find a good color. Maybe just use black. What ends up happening is these melanocytes will inject the melanin sort of into these cells that they're cradling or they're around. And then basically that we'll talk a little bit more specifically about how that exactly works. But basically, that's how it gets transferred. And then once the melanin is transferred into the keratinocytes, it remains with those cells as they progress to the more superficial layers. All right. Now we have the stratum granulosum. Okay. Basically, one of the things to kind of keep in mind is that as we're moving from down here at the stratum basale upward, we're moving further and further away from blood vessels, right? There are no blood vessels in the epidermis. All the blood vessels are in the dermis. That means any of these cells are getting their nutrients via diffusion and maybe some active transport, okay? So as you're going further and further away from your food source, basically these cells are starving. Not only that, but as you're moving from the stratum basale, these cells are they're producing a protein that will eventually turn into keratin by the time you get up to, the sort of stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum layer. So as you're going up this way, you're producing more and more of this protein, and that protein is pretty tough and hard and encases the cell in a sense. So again, it makes it really difficult for that cell to gain any nutrition. So what I'm trying to get at is that as you're moving further away from the dermis, not only are you moving further away from your blood supply where your food is, but you're also closing yourself off, so it's even more difficult for you to obtain the food even if it was available. Okay? So anyway, so this stratum granulosum is this transition between living and dead cells. So as you get into the stratum lucidum, the cells are now dead. Okay. Not very thick, about 3 to 5 layers. As these cells are dying, this is an example of apoptosis. Many of you have probably heard of this term. If you haven't, make sure you write this down. Apoptosis is simply what's known as programmed cell death. Okay, so it's not a cell dying because it's sick or injured. It is literally come to the end of its life, and basically it dies. It's called the granulosum, and hopefully you saw this underneath the microscope in lab, but it looks kind of grainy. So it's called the granulosum because it has these little granules in it. And basically these granules are going to release a lipid-rich secretion, so this fat, oily secretion. And that basically that's going to fill the spaces between the cells in the granulosum, in the lucidum, and in the corneum, in these upper layers. And basically that oil, as you know, right, water beads up on oily things and just basically rolls right off. So that's one of the things that gives you sort of a waterproofing to the outside part of your skin. All right, so stratum lucidum, this cell layer, is only found in thick skin, or what we call thick skin. So fingertips, palms of your hand, soles of your feet. Now, I'm not exactly sure why it's only found in these layers. I've actually tried to look that up, why you don't find that in other parts. I'm not sure, to be in all honesty. I'm not exactly sure why it even shows up as a stratum lucidum, as it does. However, I can tell you that this is the only places where you're going to find it. If you took skin from, like, I don't know, the back of your arm, belly, anywhere else on your body, you would not see this. So only in these areas. Again, not very thick, 3 to 5 layers, sort of similar to the granulosum. And it gets its name because it's lucid or clear. And these are flat, dead cells at this point. All right, so stratum corneum, many layers. Depending on your slides in lab, sometimes they're not, it doesn't look quite to be 25 to 30 cell sticks, sometimes it does. Now these cells are totally filled with keratin, surrounded by those lipids that we got from the stratum granulosum. So it's a nice waterproof layer, giving you, protection from the outside world. Basically, when you when you have things like a callus, right? Basically, what that is this an abnormal thickening of the stratum corneum. And really what ends up happening is if you irritate skin in a certain area, what will happen is that the skin responds by increasing the rate of mitosis. So in an area, if you keep rubbing it, like sometimes, I don't know, if you work with tools or something like that, sometimes you get those, or lift weights, you get those calluses at the base of your fingers. Um, that's because you've now irritated your skin, particularly that stratum basale, and it says, all right, look, we need to thicken this because this is clearly getting a lot of work. So again, job is to protect, so let's make sure we protect. And so now you have, since mitotic division has increased, stratum corneum becomes thicker. The whole process from the time the cells start off at the stratum basale to the time they get to the stratum corneum and then kind of flake off, that takes about 4 to 6 weeks. So around there. So you start off down here, work your way up, 4 to 6 weeks, about how long that takes. Okay. Let's see, what else? Dandruff, right? We all know what dandruff is, right? Basically what that is, that's just simply excessive amounts of these keratinized cells in the stratum corneum being shed from the skin, right? So we're all shedding it at a normal rate, but it's usually too small a rate for us to notice unless it's really excelled, I guess, if we're shedding too much from the corneum, and then you kind of notice those flakes and it's dandruff and socially embarrassing and all that kind of good stuff. All right, so I've already mentioned all of this to you guys. And here's just an electron microscope image of what an actual skin cell looks like.